If you ever find yourself feeling a bit too optimistic about the British economy, do not worry. Rachel Reeves is standing by with a bucket of ice water and a spreadsheet designed to make you weep. Welcome back to the British Report, where today we are dissecting what can only be described as a financial car crash in slow motion, except the car is the United Kingdom and the driver is currently trying to convince us that the smoke coming from the engine is actually vibrant steam of growth. We have reached a point where the Chancellor's economic strategy resembles a game of Jenga played in a hurricane. Every time she pulls a brick out, usually in the form of a tax hike, the whole structure wobbles, and yet she seems genuinely surprised when things start falling on her head. Today, that nasty slap we mentioned, it is not just one, it is a full-blown round of applause from the ghost of Christmas future, and the news is frankly dreadful. Quick favour, if you are loving this breakdown of the Westminster madness, hit that subscribe button. Over 92% of viewers haven't yet, which is a statistic more depressing than a rainy Tuesday in Hull. It is free, takes a second, and means the world to us. Thank you if you did. Now back to the show.
Is it fair for the Chancellor of the Exchequer to receive so much criticism for crying at work? Yesterday, Rachel Reeves was pictured in a state of emotional distress, tears rolling down her cheeks. Not in private, but at Prime Minister's Questions Time, the most important time of the week for the government, and only a day after the shambles of the welfare bill, where the government tried, and the government failed, to cut the ballooning benefits bill. She's since received quite a bit of criticism, I think it's fair to say. Wrongly or rightly? Hi.
Under Rachel Reeves, the headlines are starting to read like a horror novel for anyone with a bank account. Let us look at the cold, hard numbers, because as much as the Treasury likes to dress them up in fancy prose, the data does not lie. Unemployment has climbed from a relatively stable 4.1% to a staggering 5.1% on her watch. Now, in the world of securonomics, that lovely buzzword the Chancellor is so fond of, you might expect that a few growing pains are necessary. But a full percentage point jump in unemployment is not a growing pain, it is a systemic failure. It turns out that when you tax businesses into the stratosphere, they do something quite radical. They stop hiring people, or worse, they start letting them go. It is almost as if the private sector is not a bottomless well of cash that you can dip into whenever you need to fund a new government department for equality in pothole management. And then there is the growth, or lack thereof. The economy failed to grow in 5 of the 8 months leading up to November. Trend growth is currently sitting barely above zero, which in economic terms is essentially the equivalent of a flat line. When GDP rose by a microscopic 0.3% in November, Reeves was out there in front of the cameras like she had just discovered fire. She desperately tried to grab the glory for a figure that in any other developed nation would be seen as a rounding error. It is not much to boast about when your recovery is so fragile that a particularly brisk wind could knock it over. We are currently witnessing an administration that celebrates not being in a total collapse as if it were a golden age of prosperity. But the real kicker came today, the great hope for 2026, the shining light at the end of this very long, very dark tunnel, was that inflation would finally drop back to the Bank of England's 2% target. Beat inflation and living standards might at last start to recover. That is what households across this country are desperate for. Keir Starmer himself identified the cost of living crisis as the main driver of Labour's collapsing popularity. But after today's inflation bombshell, that recovery looks less like a light at the end of the tunnel and more like a train heading straight for us. If you want to know how badly we are doing, you only need to look across the English Channel. In the Eurozone, inflation has settled down to a respectable 1.9%. They are hitting their targets. Their prices are stabilising, and their consumers are starting to breathe again. What is the difference between us and them? Well, it is quite simple. Europe does not have Rachel Reeves. While the rest of the developed world is managing to steer their economies back toward normalcy, the UK is stuck in a self-inflicted cycle of high taxes and high prices. Today's data reveals that UK inflation has actually ticked back up to 3.4%. It is the first rise in months, and it has absolutely torched any hope of a February interest rate cut. Think about that for a second. We were told that the adults were back in the room, yet we are the only major economy where the cost of living is deciding to take an encore performance. Pensioners in particular are going to feel the burn. Many live on fixed incomes and they spend a much larger proportion of their money on essentials like food and fuel. These are the very things that are rising fastest thanks to what can only be described as a series of repeated policy errors from the Treasury. It is like watching a chef try to fix a salty soup by adding more salt. Reeves's first budget in October 2024 was inherently inflationary. The centrepiece, a massive £25 billion hike to employers' national insurance. Now, I do not know what they teach at the London School of Economics these days, but in the real world, businesses do not just swallow a £25 billion cost. They pass it on. They hike the price of your loaf of bread, your pint of milk, and your morning coffee. So while the Chancellor gets to boast about balancing the books, you are the one paying the Reeves tax every time you tap your card at the supermarket. Speaking of supermarkets, let us talk about the meaty 4.5% rise in food prices we have seen in the year to December. That is a faster increase than the upcoming 4.1% state pension triple lock uplift. Do the math. If the cost of your food is rising faster than your pension, you are getting poorer. It is that simple. And while the government might try to blame global factors or supply chain issues, the finger points directly back to number 11 Downing Street.
Now, a hugely fascinating angle which is emerging before tomorrow's budget is the notion that the Chancellor has hit out at her opponents as misogynists for daring to criticise her. Does she have a point, or does she need to grow a pair? Well, let's have that debate now. We're joined by the political commentator Aishi Alakhan and also the journalist Linda Duberly. Aisha, let's start with you. Why is it that you're not allowed to criticise a woman for being incompetent if you think they are, or if you're not allowed to criticise them for their decisions? Why is it they always go to the fainting couch and plead misogyny?
Hi Martin, that's not what's happened here. If you actually look at the build up to this budget, it's been absolutely brutal. There's been so many negative headlines, and it's not just obviously the build up. We're talking, if you cast your mind back to the summer when there were images of Rachel Reeves crying, flashed all over the world, that's the sort of language and attitudes that Rachel Reeves is pointing out, that none of her predecessors and none of the chancellors that I can remember have ever faced this level of scrutiny.
Take Tesco, for example. They are the UK's biggest private sector employer. When you slap a massive national insurance hike on a company with hundreds of thousands of staff, their wage bill explodes. To protect their margins, because shocker, businesses need to make a profit to exist. They raise prices, we pay, but Reeves didn't stop there. She also hit food manufacturers with a new packaging tax costing £1.4 billion a year. It is a classic move, wrap a tax hike in green credentials and hope no one notices the price tag. But what did she expect? Did she think companies would just magic that £1.4 billion out of thin air? No, they put it on the price of the plastic-wrapped chicken and the boxed cereal. Once again, we pay. It is a remarkably consistent theme of this administration. They find a successful industry, hit it with a new tax or regulation, and then express genuine confusion when the cost of living goes up. It is like breaking someone's legs and then wondering why they aren't winning any marathons. And the irony is that this is all happening under a Prime Minister who claimed his number one priority was wealth creation. At this rate, the only thing being created is a wealth of reasons to move to another country. While the private sector is being squeezed until its pips squeak, Rachel Reeves has been busy opening the checkbook for her friends in the public sector unions. Now, everyone wants nurses and teachers to be paid fairly, but the sheer scale of the settlements she has handed out is staggering. Public sector pay is currently rising at a whopping 7.9% a year. To put that in perspective, that is more than double the 3.6% pace in the private sector. This is the definition of a wage price spiral. When you pump billions into public sector wages without any corresponding increase in productivity, you are essentially printing inflation. Higher wages feed straight into higher demand, which feeds straight into higher prices. It is economics 101. Yet the Chancellor seems to think she has discovered a loophole in the laws of reality. She has borrowed and taxed more to fund this higher public spending, and every penny of that is inflationary. But wait, there is more. Let us not forget the sin taxes. Hikes to alcohol and tobacco duties have driven up prices at the tills, further fueling the inflation fire. It is a double whammy. She makes it more expensive for you to live, more expensive for you to work, and then more expensive for you to have a drink at the end of the day to forget about how expensive everything is. It is almost impressively thorough. She is like a financial Mary Poppins, but instead of a spoonful of sugar, She has a bag of salt and a very large bill. Of course, Rachel Reeves is not acting alone in this heist on the British wallet. She has a very enthusiastic accomplice in the form of Energy Secretary Ed Miliband. If Reeves is the one taking the money out of your front pocket, Miliband is the one reaching into the back. His zealous push for net zero is driving up household energy bills at a rate that is frankly alarming. We were promised that green energy would be cheaper, but so far the only thing green about it is the envy we feel for countries with sensible energy policies. The government's energy strategy is a major contributor to the stubbornness of UK inflation. When energy costs for businesses go up, everything goes up. It costs more to heat the factory, more to run the cold storage, and more to transport the goods. And who pays? You guessed it, we do. There are no prizes for guessing that the green revolution is being funded by the very people who were already struggling to keep the lights on. It is a pincer movement. On one side, you have the Treasury's tax hikes, and on the other, you have the Department for Energy's carbon neutral at any cost crusade. Between the two of them, they are making the UK one of the most expensive places in the world to do business and to live. It is no wonder that investment is stalling, and the growth Reeves is so desperate for remains a mirage on the horizon. They are trying to build a 21st century economy on 1970s tax and spend ideology, and the results are exactly what you would expect: stagnation and frustration. Now, let us get to the part that really hurts: your mortgage. For months, homeowners have been clutching their bank statements, praying for a sign that the Bank of England would finally start slashing interest rates. We were teased with the idea of a February cut, but thanks to today's inflation spike, those hopes have been unceremoniously taken out behind the barn and shot.
The modern phrase is gaslighting, isn't it? I mean, that was what I promised at the last election, was to stabilise the economy. No, it wasn't. What you promised at the last election was not to increase income tax, national insurance and VAT. One would hope that you would stabilise the economy anyway. That's sort of your job. There is the groundwork being laid, ladies and gentlemen, to explain why she thinks she's going to have to put up income tax, because otherwise there would be deep cuts in capital spending. But here's the truth. That was visible from space before the last general election. And I know I keep banging on about it, but hey, we've got to get something right. I kept trying to tell you, I kept trying to say over and over again that the Tories left cuts of some £20 billion to public services at their last budget, that all of this was out there, all of this was available to see, and Labour deliberately closed their eyes to it, said that they were going to grow the economy and that would get us out of any cuts that were going to come in the future, and that they weren't going to increase income tax, national insurance or VAT. They knew that that was going to be a promise they would be hard-pressed to keep, if at all.
Rachel Reeves loves to take the credit when interest rates go down, but she is very quiet when her policies keep them high. The reality is that we would have had several more rate cuts by now if the government hadn't been pouring inflationary gasoline onto the fire. Look at the Eurozone again. Their lending rates are down to just 2.1%. Our base rate, a painful 3.75%. That difference represents hundreds of pounds a month for the average British family. It is money that could be spent in the local economy, but instead it is being swallowed by interest payments because the government cannot get a grip on its own spending. The adults are not just back in the room, they have locked the door, lost the key, and are currently arguing about who is to blame for the smell of smoke. Homeowners and businesses are paying the price for this lack of coordination. Every month that rates stay high is another month of suppressed investment and struggling households. And yet the Chancellor continues to insist that her plan is working. If this is what working looks like, I would hate to see what a failure looks like. Oh wait, I am looking at the 5.1% unemployment rate. Everyone wants the cost of living crisis to ease. We were promised a new dawn, a change, and a government that understood the struggles of ordinary people. Instead, we have a Chancellor who seems more interested in satisfying the demands of public sector unions than in protecting the living standards of the people who actually pay for them. Thanks to Rachel Reeves and a very significant helping hand from Ed Miliband, this crisis is not going away anytime soon. It is going to drag on and on like a bad sitcom that has been renewed for far too many seasons. The nasty slap the Chancellor received today is a reminder that you cannot cheat the markets, and you certainly cannot tax your way to prosperity. You cannot claim to be the party of wealth creation while simultaneously dismantling the very mechanisms that create wealth. As long as this government continues to prioritise ideology over economics, the British public will continue to pay and pay We are the ones footing the bill for the dreadful errors that are now becoming the hallmark of this administration. Thank you for watching the British Report. If you want to stay informed on the latest twists and turns in the Westminster Circus, make sure to like and share this video. We will be here to break it all down for you. See you in the next one.